So Jacob, over to you, about 35 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Perfect, yes, cut me off, because
Oh,
I
don't
think,
worry.
I think I have more in here than I should. All right, hello, everyone, welcome back. We are a cozier group, which is nice. So I'm Jacob Remes, just as a reminder. I'm a historian, but I teach at the Galton School of Individualized Study at New York University, which is a funny interdisciplinary school where I never teach kind of straight history, and therefore I get the freedom to my last article that's going to come out soon is about birds and disaster, and I get to do things like talk to you about trees, which is what I'm going to do today. And this, I should warn you, this is a very unfinished kind of scattered. It's kind of just going to be a slideshow of trees, you'll see. But it started actually on the same trip that Scott was just talking about last summer when we went to Hoku and toured with a group of other disaster scholars and students. Up and down the Tohoku coast are the ruins of schools. Scott showed you two of them. There are several more. Officially, they stand as memorials to either survival or to deaths, to the creativity and heroic rule breaking of school personnel to help their students escape, or to the blinkered and murderous refusal to break rules, right? One or the other. Mostly the former, because in fact, schools were on 311 the safest place to be. With the exception of Okawa Elementary School, only 2 students who were at a school at the time of the tsunami died. At Okawa Elementary School, it was the opposite. Only 2 students survived. But in many places now, again, Scott showed you this a little bit, those buildings, those ruined school memorials are the only buildings around, only buildings in eyesight, because the neighborhoods they once served have been declared too unsafe to rebuild. And so as we looked at these memorials, they seem to be as much memorials to the aging society, the Japanese demographic crisis, the depopulation of rural Japan, that is to the communities that even before the 311 tsunami had fewer and fewer children to occupy their schools. And I think, so this got me thinking about disaster memorials and their changing meanings even as the memorials themselves, the goal is to keep them static. So actually one of the things I was thinking about, I was reminded of looking at Scott's pictures of those 2 schools that he showed, was the challenge, the conservation challenge of preserving a ruin. Right? How do you keep the ruin at just the right level of ruination and not any more? And for that matter, not any less. But even beyond that conservation challenge, how do you maintain the meaning of that school? So I've been thinking about this since Ksenia invited me. I've been thinking about this question of disaster memorials. But then last week, I was leading a group of students to Chile, where we were doing kind of a trip to think about states of emergency in the Pinochet regime and states of disaster in the post-dictatorship democratic moment. And we visited this memorial in Concepcion, which is the memorial to the 2010 earthquake. As it says, the earthquake and the following tsunami. And it is, to be frank, one of the worst memorials I have ever been to. On this blank plaza, very cement, every surface of it every reachable surface of it covered with graffiti and broken glass. What was supposed to happen was that the inside, behind those gates, the inside was supposed to have the names of the slightly over 500 people who died in the earthquake and the names of the towns that were damaged. They never bothered to finish inscribing them, and so now the gates are just perpetually closed. This is a hated memorial. The communities were not involved in planning it. It's in a location that has nothing particularly to do with the actual damage that was caused. And it has no argument. It's really unclear what it's memorializing. They'll tell you, oh, that this kind of askew towers are supposed to be are supposed to mimic being in an earthquake. But it just doesn't work. And you can tell how much it is disliked by the community by the way it is kept up. It was also very expensive, and they spent even more money to maintain it, but in a way that clearly is not maintained. So I had in mind, so I was already thinking about this, but last week I went to this kind of failed disaster memorial and was thinking even more about what is it, should we be thinking about memorializing disaster in literally concretizing the meaning of disaster. So to think about that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of memorialization in the disaster that I have studied most intensively, which was an explosion that occurred when a French munition ship, a ship carrying explosives bound for the World War I front, collided with a Norwegian ship carrying Belgian relief supplies in the narrows of Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia, in Canada on the morning of December 6, 1917. The resulting explosion killed about 2,000 people, maimed or blinded about 9,000, and made about 18,000 people homeless or jobless. It ruined about a quarter of the city. And among the things that it ruined were 4 churches, an Anglican, Presbyterian, Catholic, and Methodist church, and the neighborhoods that those churches served. Those churches all rebuilt, but the Methodist and Presbyterian church rebuilt together in what was an early instance of what in Canada is called church union. Eventually, the Methodist and Presbyterian churches in 1925, the Methodist and Presbyterian churches merged to become the United Church of Canada. And this was, the negotiations had been going on a long time, so this was not kind of a new idea, but this was a harbinger of that merger. So first, they rebuilt what was called the tar paper church, made out of roofing tar paper, that they were in for several years. And then, I'll get to where they rebuilt later. Sorry, the picture comes later. But the point is, when they rebuilt the church, it was the church and the church community that was itself the memorial. Parishioners gave money to give the baptistry and the pulpit and pews in memory of their dead relatives. Most famously, the bells in the carillon were given by a woman named Barbara Orr, who had inherited money from her dead family because she was the only survivor, and so she gave the bells in memory of her family. So it was physically the church that was the memorial for this community, but also the joined community of the church, of the Presbyterian and Methodist church that came together, that was the community, that was the memorial itself. Sort of the next memorial that was built was this church. This actually wasn't until 1964, when the Halifax Relief Commission, which was the government body that had been established to rebuild the devastated area and administer relief and rehabilitation funds, spent $100,000 to build this library. I should say, I don't know what you call it, the sculpture that's in the front, that was not part of the original, that's not part of the original library, that's not part of the memorial process, and it actually doesn't refer to it's a kind of a celebration of the neighborhood. It's not the rebuilt neighborhood. It's not doesn't have anything to do with the explosion. So rebuilding this was about, again, building a community, giving the infrastructure, the needed social, cultural infrastructure for this working class community. It was also about spending money, because the Relief Commission had long been criticized for hoarding its funds. And so this was a way of kind of pushing some money out the door and not having as much. In both the churches and the library, the memory of the explosion is living. That's the true memorial is the community. The built memorials were about making sense of the suffering, to say that the deaths that occurred on December 6th and following, and the injuries of those who lived, were not just individual losses, but rather a matter of public concern, something different from ordinary mortality and suffering. I'm going to take a little bit of a digression here, because I think when I think about community as memorial, I think of Piero Calamandri's poem to Albert Kesselring. Kesselring had commanded the Nazi army in Italy and had been tried, convicted, and imprisoned for war crimes. But he was released and sent home to Germany in 1952 because of his supposed ill health. When he returned to Bavaria and to the embrace of his old Nazi buddies, among whom he lived for 8 years, so much for his failing health, he declared that he was sorry for nothing and indeed that the Italians ought to build him a monument. So Calamandri's poem was in response. You will get it, Field Marshal Kesselring, the monument you demand, he promises, but it will not be built in stone, not even the stone of the defenseless villages you destroyed, not even with the soil of our cemeteries. No, it will be harder than any stone because it will be built from the silence of the tortured. Resistance is now and forever the monument to fascism. I should say there's a little bit of an irony, since as you can see in the picture, the poem is then inscribed on stone and put all around Italy in resistance memorials. But if you can ignore that irony for a moment, the idea that the memorial, that harder than any stone, better than any built memorial, is the community of, I have to find it, of free men who volunteered for the dignity of humanity. The end is, if you dare to come back to our streets, you will find us at our posts. The living and the dead alike. The people with the strongest monument that is always known forever as resistance. This recalls to me the disaster geographer Ken Hewitt's admonition that resilience must be resistance to the political economy that produces disaster risk. But really, I bring it up to suggest that the true memorial is the community forged in struggle and survival, whether that struggle is against the Nazis or, again, for survival in more traditional disaster, like what we've been talking about. So with that little digression, to return to the memorial church, this was the picture I was looking for before. This is the church that replaced the tar paper church, big and heavy and grand with a nice towers for barbaric wars. Bells, except that it wasn't such a nice tower, and in the 1970s it started to fall down, and so they had to take the bells out. The bells sat in the front yard for a while, until finally, in 1984, this thing was built. So this was really the first civic memorial to the disaster, built in 1984. It was accompanied by an oral history project in which an amateur historian named Janet Kitts interviewed survivors. By that point, by 1984, most of the survivors were very old people who had been very young at the time of the explosion. So this was put up. This is now kind of the built center of the Halifax memorial culture in Halifax. This is where the memorial ceremony takes place every December 6th. They used to ring bells. They stopped ringing the bells several years ago. There's talk maybe this year they'll bring it back. I think maybe they can't find someone to play them. I don't know why. The Halifax explosion is very remembered in Halifax. It's all over. There was a big movement of pop music in Halifax in the 1990s, and it was called the Halifax Pop Explosion. It's all over, right? Like, people know about the Halifax explosion, is remembered, but not based around this memorial. So now where is the memorial going, right? Cities change, communities change. The North End Library that or the Halifax North Memorial Library that I showed you is now decrepit, in desperate need for so far unfunded a need for renovation. And the connection to the memorial itself is mostly unremarked. People call it North Library, not North Memorial Library. When librarians made this call to get money last summer, there was mention of the working class community it serves, but no mention of the explosion. The memorials constructed by the survivors, the churches, are now irrelevant. Nobody is alive who remembers the explosion. Few people are alive who remembered the second generation. All around this memorial, it's on Needham Hill, which is an important space where people gathered on December 6th. to kind of shelter before they got evacuated further away. All on it now is a new set of memorials, which unfortunately I don't get pictures of, which are much more didactic. They're cut steel and they tell the story, the historical story of what happened on the day and after to a generation that is thought might not otherwise know the historical details. So I want to point out kind of three moments of memorialization here. There's the immediate aftermath, where survivors came together and rebuilt their communities and their community institutions. There's a middle period that happens as those survivors are dying of old age. That's this. And then there's now, when here's United Memorial Church. This is taken in 1918. It sits empty. Nobody knows the church itself has disbanded. The church is owned by a property developer, but has been landmarked. And so the debate about what to do with it is phrased in the argument of historic preservation. But really, it's about questions of gentrification. It's about who should be living in the north end of Halifax. So here's another, there's the Catholic Church that was built in 1961 to replace the old one. This has now been knocked down and replaced by condos. This is what is in its place. And what you'll see here is they saved the memorial windows from the church. So those windows kind of pasted on that ugly building are memorial windows to the explosion, just kind of tacked on to this totally irrelevant development. To my mind, actually, this is far worse. They should have just gotten rid of the windows. This is worse than the possibility. But what I want to propose here is that built memorials face a problem. It's a problem of permanence, or at least of imagined permanence. They try to impose a meaning, which they hope will be static, on the events they memorialize. But as time passes, the meaning changes. We're then faced with the problem of what to do with these built objects. Do you preserve the architecture of United Memorial Church, even though the congregation is no more? Do you keep the St. Joseph windows pasted onto the ugly condo development? My answer is this beech tree, which sits on Fort Needham Hill within shouting distance of the 1984 Memorial Carillon. It is, Haligonians believe, a witness tree, which is to say that it witnessed the explosion. It's a living thing. Like Halifax, it grows and it changes. And yes, it will eventually die. Just as the Haligonians who sat by it on the morning of December 6, 1917, took different meanings from it, so too do its visitors now. There is no didacticism to it. For those who know or believe that it witnessed the explosion, it is a reminder of the landscape that is shared across history, a living connection to the events of 1917. A witness tree, writes historian Dagan Miller, who's a US historian, was a tree that had once seen something remarkable, a repository for the secrets of the past. The phrase witness tree comes originally from cadastral maps, so maps that surveyors took to mark property. And in the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States, they would mark, rather than putting in a pipe where the corner was or where the length they were measuring to, they would say there's a big oak tree. And nowadays, actually, those witness trees are used by ecologists to measure change in landscapes, because it's this several centuries record of old trees. And like a courtroom witness, it gives testimony to who owned what, these cadastral witness trees. But there's also a long history of witness trees as a form of memorial. So I'm going to show you three kind of arbitrary ones. So here is the cotton tree in Freetown, Sierra Leone, under which Nova Scotia Black loyalists who founded Liberia held their first Baptist religious service. It subsequently became a symbol of the city and indeed the country. As one tourist brochure puts it, it's surrounded by, yet dominating, the principal buildings of church, law, and government. Except that it's not anymore because it fell down. In a rainstorm last year, there was a big rainstorm, it fell down. The president of the country issued a memorial statement to the tree. And here's another example, habaku trees Habakujumoko, in Hiroshima, or more rarely Nagasaki. They are trees that survived the atomic bombings. So this is the same tree, the eucalyptus tree, about 740 miles from the hypocenter, one taken in 1945 by a Japanese scientist, and then a picture from 2005. For the volunteers who continue to care for these trees, which were of course severely damaged but survived, they are multifarious symbols of survival and rebirth, of a living connection to memory, and to the process of tending and caring for aged Hibashika humans and their memories. And then here's another example, the survivor tree. In New York, this was a tree that was at the World Trade Center that was in the rubble of the World Trade Center. It was actually extracted from the rubble and replanted in this garden, as you can see, kind of festooned with symbols of patriotic mourning, as so much of the World Trade Center is. In the United States, witness trees are most associated with the Civil War, with Civil War battlefields. So here is a honey locust at Gettysburg. That both the idea is witnessed the battle at Gettysburg, but also Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, in which he dedicated the cemetery that you see behind it. So one thing about witness trees is that they inspire all sorts of memorial practices themselves. So here is a memorial to a witness tree, a witness to a witness tree in Bloomington, Illinois. So I want to call your attention here to two things. First is that even the plaque is a reproduction of the original plaque that was attached to the original tree. The original tree is now gone. The plaque is in the local historical society. This is a reproduction of it. So there's many steps removed that it can continue on. The second is the uncertainty of the language of the plaque. It is said that the Lincoln-Douglas debate was under this tree. The Lincoln-Douglas debate was this or Lincoln-Douglas debates was a sort of key moment in American history before the Civil War. It doesn't matter, but that places you in time is right before the American Civil War. So recall similarly that the beech tree in Halifax that I showed you is also just thought to be a witness tree. The tradition of witness trees necessarily includes subjectivity, incomplete and changing memories, memories of memories, memorials of memorials. They are the opposite, I'm trying to argue, of a steel and concrete memorial. Maybe one of the most famous trees in the United States is this one, which has not been alive since 1856, which remains the symbol of the US state of Connecticut. In 1686, King James II tried to revoke his predecessor's colonial charter for Connecticut and consolidate it into the Dominion of New England so as to exercise more direct control over Puritan colonists. When the Governor General, Sir Edmund Andros, arrived to confiscate the old charter of the colony of Connecticut, the colonists hid it, or so the legend says, in this oak tree. The tree subsequently became a symbol of Connecticut and its self-governance. Supposedly, this very tree was also described even before it became the hiding place of the charter, described by a Dutch explorer, and again, supposedly, was the symbol of a peace treaty among indigenous peoples before colonization. As my use of the word supposedly should imply, I don't actually believe the accuracy of any part of this story, but it doesn't matter. That is, what matters here isn't the fact of the tree's planting or its Dutch description or its use to hide a settler colonial legal document. Rather, what matters is that it has remained a meaningful marker of cultural identity and memory, even though the memory itself, what is being remembered, is malleable. And crucially, it has remained a symbol long past its death in a storm in 1856. This painting, for instance, was painted the year after the tree fell down. This continues. So in 1966, a scion of the charter oak, so second or third generation at least, was planted in the town of Cornwall, Connecticut, which is in the northwest corner of Connecticut, a town of about 1,500 people now. This is one of many such trees that are around the state children and grandchildren of the oak. So there's it being planted. There is it, not exactly today, but more or less today, and a little plaque underneath the tree as it stands now. The tree is actually a little bit healthier. That 2012 picture was taken at the winter before there had been a big snowstorm and it had damaged some branches come down. The tree looks better now. The tree still, so the United States had a state quarter program where each state designed the obverse of the quarter and circulate around. So on the Connecticut quarter was a picture of the oak. It is the name of one of the bridges that crosses the Connecticut River in the state capital. There's the Charter Oak Bridge. It's also the name of the online state university, Charter Oak State University. It remains part of the state elementary school curriculum. I was talking about this to two friends of mine who grew up in Connecticut, and I started to explain the Connecticut oak, and they looked at me like I was an idiot and said, "We know about the Charter Oak. We went to school in Connecticut." When it died, when the original Charter Oak died, but also when its children have been have come down, they are carved into relics, and their descendants, as you can see, are still marked and celebrated. Because trees are living things that reproduce, the perpetuation of trees through their descendants is a common part of witness tree memory culture. Mayors for Peace continues to distribute seedlings from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki hibaku trees. They proudly say that there are hibaku tree descendants in 111 cities in 26 countries. The 9/11 memorial sends survivor tree seedlings to 3 cities that they choose each year that have endured tragedy in recent years, is their phrase. So there's a lot of what you do with these seedlings is imbued with the ideology of the memorial, right? So for the Charter Oak, it is sent to the small towns throughout Connecticut to celebrate their Connecticutness. For the hibaku trees, they are sent around to be demands or memorials for peace. And for the 9/11 survivor tree, it's about kind of a neoliberal idea of resilience and depoliticized tragedy. I want to just draw a distinction between memorial trees, which is to say trees planted as a memorial, because they often don't work. People actually often plant trees to remember a dead loved one, and they pick the type of tree that the loved one liked and a place that the loved one liked, and those they don't think about what actually grows well in different places, and so actually memorial trees die early all the time. So I want to be thinking about these are trees that pre-existed the event that they are memorializing. I should also say, because we talked about this question of disasters as events, that one of the things that memorial trees do is they act over a long time span, right? They were witnesses, yes, to the event that we are memorializing, but they were equally witnesses to things that happened to the conditions before whatever the event was, to the conditions that built the disaster risk. And of course, they are witnesses into the future. So they transcend this time, and they grow and they change over time. So if they're different from memorial trees, I think as the Charter Oak suggests, they're a little bit closer to another sort of tree that we talk about in American history, which is to say lynching trees. So trees that were used for the extra legal hanging, largely of Black people, but also people of other races in racial and other terrorism. Some of those trees are now also marked as essentially historical actors in this story of American racial terrorism. In a similar way, not in a similar way, but in an analogous way to how the Charter Oak was not merely a witness, but was supposedly a participant in the charter. But most witness trees, the ones I really want us to think about, were mere witnesses to the events, not involved. So the Lincoln Douglas tree in Bloomington, Illinois that I showed you listened to an important debate in US history. The beech tree on Needham Hill in Halifax stood during the explosion. These trees remind us how we are embedded in systems that combine the social and the natural, the horrible and the beautiful. They inspire us to ask what the tree knows, what sorts of knowledge and memory might be inscribed in the landscape itself. Trees inspire introspection. They are not didactic and they change. So this is a picture taken by one of my students with whom I was in Chile, of a tree at Villa Grimaldi, which was an estate and a park associated with artists and intellectuals on the outskirts of Santiago. After the 1973 coup, the Pinochet regime expropriated the Villa Grimaldi and turned it into a detention and torture site where about 4,500 people were detained and at least 226 people were disappeared. In the post-dictatorship, it has been turned into a site of memory in a process largely led by survivors. Survivors recall the brief respite of standing in the tree's shade, and they recalled looking at the tree from their cells. Amid other parts of the built and memorial environment, including a preservation of the buildings where people were tortured, a newly built building that serves as an exhibit of archaeological sites that prove that torture and murder happened at this site, and a series of sort of memorial sculptures built by different political tendencies to recognize the different left-wing political tendencies and parties that the victims belong to. Amid this built-in memorial environment, the tree stands as a reminder of how even as political dissidents were subjected to torture and murder, they were in a place of intentionally cultivated beauty. It forces visitors to reckon with the incongruity of evil amidst beauty. I'm reminded of the Holocaust memoirist Ruth Kluger, who in her memoir, Still Alive, makes her readers reckon with how in a concentration camp, she took solace in humming to herself the very same Beethoven that her guards celebrated as the epitome of German culture. She kind of spends a while trying to reckon and forcing her reader to reckon with what does beauty mean in the concentration camp. As non-human witnesses, a tree raises questions that humans grapple with but cannot answer. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you two art pieces that I think are kind of useful to think about here. One is Joseph Boy's 1982 land art piece, 7,000 Oaks, in which he planted, not actually 7,000 oaks, around Kassel, Germany, with these stones. So there was this giant pile of stones that were in the town square that gradually decreased as the trees were planted. And here is Julius von Bismarck, a contemporary artist, and his work, Baum Analysis, where he takes a box cutter and he circles this oak tree over and over and slowly cuts it down with a box cutter. Both of these works, which we can talk about in the questions if you are so moved, raise questions of time and space, memory and futurity through their manipulation of oak trees. And finally, I'm going to rush through this. This is the picture that was on the brochure for this, the website for this. Back to Tohoku on the northeast coast of Japan to think about a different sort of memorial tree. So this is the miracle pine, the Ipunmatsu, in Rikuzentakata, which became famous after the tsunami because it was the only thing that survived, that stood. And so there was lots of celebration of it until about a year later, it started to die because it had been poisoned by saltwater. And so the town cut it down and carefully disassembled it, hollowed it out, filled it with cement, and essentially turned it into a sculpture of a tree. It is now classified under Japanese law, not as a tree, but as a structure. And it will last. It is simultaneously a tree. It celebrates a tree, and yet it is not a tree and will last, at least if not forever, for a long time. Much like unlike Freetown's cotton tree or Connecticut's charter oak, it won't die, or at least it won't die again. But like the hibaku trees or the survivor tree or the charter oak, its seedlings were preserved and get distributed around, mostly in thanks to other cities in Japan that lent aid. And I am freed from having to figure out, I spent a long time trying to think, what was I going to say about this tree? In the end, given what I just showed you about witness trees, and I don't quite know what to think about it because of it's because it's a cyborg tree, right? Because it is both a natural and not, because because of his strange status, and because Ksenia wants me to stop talking, I am freed from having to give you a conclusion. And I look forward to hearing what you think about this trip.